Continuing the introduction, by 1958, the communist guerrillas in South Vietnam had become more active, and what is termed the Second Indochina War, actually an insurrection that became a revolutionary civil war, began. In this conflict, beyond financing the South Vietnamese and supplying them with arms and economic assistance, the United States soon came to play a more active role by sending military advisors to the Diem government and later to the successors of that government. Under the rather obscure terms of the Geneva Protocol, such advisors were to be limited to a few hundred, but in view of the fact that the Communists had violated the Geneva Agreement by leaving numerous underground agents in the South while withdrawing some cadres north for retraining and re-indoctrination, the United States felt it was justified in sending additional military aid to the South Vietnamese when they formally asked for such help in men and materiel. This step-up, which had begun under the Eisenhower administration, was increased by President Kennedy and then again increased immeasurably by President Johnson. By the spring of 1966, some 250,000 American military men were in South Vietnam or en route there, and the total, it was said, would probably reach 400,000 by the end of 1966. The beginning year figures included about 45,000 Marines, with more due shortly, all or part of 6 Army Infantry Airborne and Paratroop Divisions or brigades and their various supporting elements, military advisors and their administrative and supporting contingents, a Marine Air Wing, and sizable Army Air Force units ranging from the most modern jet fighters and bombers to helicopters and lumbering transports and smaller numbers of Navy and Coast Guard personnel. When the big build-up began in the spring of 1965, the task initially assigned to the American ground elements was to guard key bases in the northern and central sectors of the country. But they soon began to undertake actual combat assignments, either in conjunction with Vietnamese forces in seeking out the Viet Cong or on their own. In January 1966, the regular South Vietnamese Army forces totaled 270,000, and the paramilitary forces, the so-called Regional and Popular Force troops, approximately 340,000. Together with a reinforced South Korean division and small Australian and New Zealand elements, the total Allied strength in South Vietnam, not including some 70,000 men of the United States 7th Fleet stationed offshore, had thus reached about 850,000, and by the end of the year would probably be more than 1 million. In contrast, the Communists had a total strength of approximately 250,000, including some 80,000 so-called hardcore Southern elements and the equivalent of 3 North Vietnamese regular divisions of 8,000 men each, a figure it was expected could well rise to 6 divisions within a matter of months. The rate of infiltration from the north into the south, mostly via the system of roads and jungle paths through North Vietnam, Laos, and South Vietnam, known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail, was estimated at about 2,000 a month, and could, it was anticipated, go as high as 4,000 or more. The interdiction of this tortuous resupply route was an extremely difficult task. Air attacks mounted from South Vietnam, from the 7th Fleet carriers, and from bases in Thailand, even when employing the latest scientific devices of time bombs, infrared detection, and so on, could only accomplish so much, and to meet the infiltration challenge on the ground would require 4 divisions, in the opinion of most military experts, a heavy additional troop element that would be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to keep supplied over a long and hazardous land route. As the American buildup had mounted and the Americans assumed a more direct and important role in the fighting, the former role of military advisors had naturally changed. Actually, even before the large numbers of American troops were brought in as defensive or offensive elements, the advisors, only about 5,500 of whom were in the field, assigned to Vietnamese units from battalions on up through the level of the 4 Vietnamese Corps, had found it ever harder to draw the line between rendering advice and actually participating in the conflict. More and more they had found themselves engaged in offensive as well as defensive actions as they accompanied Vietnamese troops into battle, but they had all along been handicapped by the lack of any command function. By 1965, these advisors were being assimilated into the new command structure of the American fighting machine in Vietnam, directed by General William C. Westmoreland, though they maintained their advisory function. While General Westmoreland directed all the American and other foreign fighting men in the South, and with the help of his Air Force staff controlled the daily air attacks within the country, there was still no single joint command embracing both Allied and South Vietnamese forces. Although a series of regional joint commands were sometimes set up for individual operations and there was a loosely coordinated general command system, it remained General Westmoreland's feeling that a unified joint command would create more problems than it would solve, and that it was vital to continue to respect South Vietnamese sovereignty and to maintain the American position primarily as one of assistance to a beleaguered ally. To do anything else, he reasoned, would simply play into the hands of communist propaganda that the war had become an American one, comparable to the early French struggle. Certainly the South Vietnamese were still bearing the brunt of the war. American casualties by the end of 1965 had reached about 1,500 killed and 7,300 wounded. The South Vietnamese figures since January 1, 1961 were 30,000 killed and 63,000 wounded. The Viet Cong, it was estimated, had in all lost about 100,000 killed and 250,000 wounded. Originally, American pilots in Vietnam had been designated to fly helicopters carrying Vietnamese troops into battle and to pilot fighter and bomber planes in the course of instructing Vietnamese. As the pace of the war had increased, these functions, too, had inevitably changed and caused a more direct American involvement. Though the prime factor in the American buildup was the increased scope and intensity of the Viet Cong attacks in the South countryside, the more dramatic aspect of America's entry into the contest had been incited by North Vietnamese attacks on American warships in the Gulf of Tonkin in the north, and then by Viet Cong attacks on American installations in the South. These had resulted in the first retaliatory air assaults by the United States on bases in North Vietnam in the summer of 1964 and again in early 1965. The second bombing of the North was soon followed by sustained American air attacks there, as well as on Viet Cong bases, supply lines, and troop concentrations in South Vietnam, and on communist lines of communication in neighboring Laos. The Laos attacks had actually begun secretly in the fall of 1964. By March 1965, joint American and Vietnamese Air Force raids on communist bases and on highways, bridges, rail lines, and radar installations in North Vietnam had become virtually a daily occurrence. And the intensity of these attacks and of North Vietnamese anti-aircraft resistance progressively increased. Similarly, the Viet Cong in the South were now subjected to constant raids, and, in fact, it was generally agreed that had it not been for tactical air raids involving support for American and South Vietnamese ground actions against the attacking Viet Cong in the summer of 1965, the Communists might well have succeeded in cutting South Vietnam in two in the Central Plateau and in winning the war. By the end of 1965, American and Vietnamese pilots had flown about 12,000 sorties. One flight in one plane is a sortie over North Vietnam, and there had been about as many strikes from the carriers in the China Sea. The total number of sorties in South Vietnam had reached about 100,000. In all, about 200 American planes had been shot down.